We're going to be in Luke chapter 10 this morning. Luke chapter 10, specifically verses 25 to 37. If you need a Bible and don't have one, there should be one in the chair in front of you. Today we're going to start a new series. It's a short series. It's going to last 3 weeks, called The Art of Neighboring. Recently, and it's going to be based on the Bible, but what got me thinking about it was this book called The Art of Neighboring by Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon. In fact, we put it in our resource center over here in case any of you want to purchase this book just for follow-up reading. It's really good. And the reason it got me thinking is the understanding that sometimes as Christians, we are really good at pointing out all of the things in the world that we would like to see changed. But what if the answer to all of those things was if we did exactly what Jesus just said do and love our neighbor as ourselves? To extend the kind of love in a neighborly way to the people who are around us in a way that might change their life, their outlook, their thoughts. You know, how many of you, do you have a neighborhood from your childhood that you look back on and you remember everything about that particular neighborhood? I have that. We lived in Brentwood, Tennessee back in the day, in this little old neighborhood named Hallbrook. And it kind of looks like a Brady Bunch sort of neighborhood, sort of that era of homes. But the thing that was so cool about that as a kid is we all knew each other. Like everybody in the whole neighborhood knew each other. And to this day, we know at least about each other. There was the Hobbs family. The Hobbs family lived just up the street from me, and his dad, Brad's dad, put a pitching mound in his front yard, built one with a pitching stop and all that. So baseball all summer long in his front yard, right? And then we played football at Chris Beasley's house during football season, and you know the lines were the ditch. If you went past the ditch, you're going to hit the road anyway, and so it was going to be bad for you. So that was the sideline. But we every day after school, I mean, almost every day we would play out there football. We played basketball at the McCamish's house. There were people that lived next to me. He was kind of a larger than life. It was Nashville, right? So this guy's name was Biff Cauley. He was a DJ, and some of you know him? Anybody know him? Ever heard about him? He knew everybody, so I wouldn't be surprised if he knew you. He knew Conway Twitty, so he might know you. But he lived right next door, and we just knew everybody. And even like we left there, we moved to Katy, Texas when I was 16 years old. And when I graduated from high school, I got a card from the Durthicks that lived in that neighborhood, you know, down the road, and we just kept in touch through the years. It was awesome, actually. We didn't all have the same faith system. We didn't all believe the same things about God. Some of us definitely had different moral compasses than others, but it was just a day where we all sort of connected, and we knew each other. And so, but today is a very different day. Have you noticed? In your neighborhood today, and some of you still have it, but a lot of us in our neighborhood today, if I were to say, look, if you're in one of those sort of neighborhood master plan community areas, if you take the 3 houses in front of you, the 3 houses behind you, the 2 on each side, and tell me the name of each person that lives in each one of those houses. The research says that about 10% of you, including me, would be able to do that. Now, we're in a unique area. We come from sort of all different places. We don't all live in master plan communities. But if you were to just try to think about the 8 neighbors that live in and around where you live, and maybe you are in the 10%, you know their names, but if it were to get down into like what are they going through? What do they need? You might not know that much. And it's interesting that Jesus says, as he sums up all the law and the prophets, that we love God with everything we are, and we should love our neighbor as ourselves. Like, this was the plan to disseminate the love of the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout the world. And he addresses that here in Luke chapter 10. So I'm going to ask you to stand with me as we read this, Luke chapter 10, 25 to 37. Thank you. And let's hear what he has to say. If you're our guest, by the way, we say this phrase, the very words at the end of the main text reading. Here's what the scripture says. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. He said to him, You've answered correctly, do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be the neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, You go and do likewise. You can be seated. So, I want to talk to you today about the idea, what if we took the Great Commandment that we read here seriously? Matthew 22, in fact, 37 to 40 calls this the Great Commandment. And here it's restated, and Jesus adds a parable to it. And it's really interesting to understand the simple solution that Jesus gives to really what's going on in the culture of the day and how we should really live that out. And the simple solution to all these complex problems in the first century is love God and love your neighbor. Love God and love your neighbor. Now, what I want to share with you today is the simple solution to all of the complex problems in the 21st century, like something that you can do, is to love God and love your neighbor. It's interesting when you look at this passage of scripture. I think it says, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test. So when you think of a lawyer, I don't know what you think about, trial lawyer, personal injury lawyer, all those kinds of things. This is not one of those. This is a Torah lawyer. So he's an expert in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Remember, we're in Jerusalem. Okay, and so when it says a lawyer stood up, it's someone who's an expert in the law. All 613 commands, all the intricacies of it, all the interpretation of it. And his mode here is to trick Jesus into answering poorly in front of a lot of really important people in Jerusalem. Okay, that's what's happening here. Now, he says, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Big question. I think he wants Jesus to say, you have to come straight through me. But Jesus turns it around and asks him another question. He said to him, what is written in the law? Now, in the Hebrew, there is sarcasm. There is a remez there. It's more like this. What's written in the law? Lawyer, man. You're the lawyer. You tell me. That kind of thing. And so Jesus turns it back on him, and he answers correctly. He takes the law, Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, and Leviticus 19, 18, and he puts them together, and he actually states Jesus' own rabbinic interpretation of the law. We have to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We have to love our neighbor as yourself. Jesus is like, high five, way to go, lawyer. You've interpreted it correctly. Do this and you shall live. Well, the lawyer hasn't gotten what he wanted. See, he wanted a riot in the street. He really wanted conflict. He hasn't got it yet, so he goes a step further and asks a provocative question. It may not seem so provocative to you, but the question is really clear. It's a significant question. Who is my neighbor? And we find this in verses 30 to 37. So let me just run down this with you so you understand the story. Now remember, this is Jesus telling a story, okay? It's a parable. And here's what we get. We get a guy walking from Jerusalem, on the path from Jerusalem to Jericho, which, let me just explain that path. Jerusalem is high, Jericho is low. So it's straight down along the way, high crevices, ravines, it's dark, dank, dusty, all of it. I mean, you're talking about a sort of a treacherous path. It is not a super highway. So the widest parts of the path are like this widest part of this aisle right here, that aisle right there. It is not a wide path. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is not any sort of super highway, the ancient path. And so we get Jesus telling this story to a bunch of Jerusalemites, many of them religious leaders, and he says to them, a man was beaten, robbed, and left half dead on this path. And then a priest came by. The priest came by and he passed by on the other side. Now, the reason I tell you what the path is like is because it's not like he was over there on that side of the room and the priest walked, way over there on the other side of the room. In this story, the priest literally has to step over a little of this guy. I mean, it probably looked more like that, right? And then a temple assistant comes by. He does the same thing, passes by on the other side. Now, you're hoping, if you're a Jerusalemite and you're a religious leader, that the priest would handle this correctly. You're hoping that the temple assistant would handle this correctly. But in Jesus' story, they just passed by on the other side. So now you're thinking of excuses for them. Why would they pass by on the other side? Maybe the priest had to do something in Jericho before sundown. Maybe he had been in Jerusalem and done all his ceremonial washing and all of that kind of stuff, and he didn't want to miss his deadline. He didn't want to be unclean to do whatever priestly duties he needed to do when he got to Jericho. So, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. I'm supposed to talk to 500 people down there before sundown, and this guy is here. He's just one. I don't want to be unclean when I get there. Pass by on the other side. Maybe same thing with the temple assistant. But then it says a Samaritan came. Now, again, for us, that's not too provocative, but if you're standing there in the streets of Jerusalem in the first century, this is a very provocative statement. Because now you're comparing a Samaritan to a Levite, someone from the line of Aaron, the high priest, and a priest, just a temple priest. A Samaritan, again, what is this? So a Samaritan, you have to understand that what happened was in about the 700s BC before Jesus and a little bit later, there's two guys come through there, Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib. And they take the Jews that are living in that particular region, they disperse them, and then they take people from all over the world that were also their slaves, and they put them living in Samaria, and they bring with them idols, religion, they intermarry. And so the Samaritans, by the time you get to the first century, are looked at best as half Jews, but idolaters, unclean, so unclean in fact that they've been encouraged, and they did, build their own temple in Samaria. They didn't want to go to the temple in Jerusalem because they really didn't like how they were treated over there, and the Jerusalemites, the Israelites really did not want them to come to the temple either, so they had their own thing, which was also unclean and gave the Jews more fuel for the fire, right? They worship over there. You may remember, some of you that have pictures in your head from the scriptures, you may remember that Jesus said to the woman at the well, one day a day is coming when we won't worship over here or over there, but we're going to worship all together in spirit and truth. Okay, he was in Samaria at a well with the woman at the well. So he's picking up on an important contrast of the day. You worship here, and they worship there. We're going to all worship together. Okay, so, but viewed as very unclean. It would be like saying, in our day, it's so provocative in that moment. It would be like saying, this is the best thing that I can think of, and it's not exactly right, but it's almost right. But it's like Pastor Brian came by, and he passed by on the other side. And Pastor Zach, he came by, and he passed by on the other side. But Ahmed, he stopped. A member of ISIS, he stopped. Okay, so that's the kind of provocative, there's conflict in this story for the people that are listening to it. They're already like, the temple priest didn't go by, the Levite didn't go by, but now the Samaritan terrorist, unclean, he's going to stop, and that's exactly what happens. The Samaritan stops, and Jesus goes on here and begins to just tell us the story that he went to him. He had compassion. He bound up his wounds. He poured oil on him. He gave him first aid. He took him to an inn. He paid the beginning of that tab, and then he left an open tab and said, you know what? When I come back, I'll pay the rest. Just take care of him. And then Jesus asked the lawyer, the Torah lawyer, the religious lawyer, who then was most neighborly? Who is the neighbor to this man? Forcing the lawyer, who doesn't want to look like an idiot answering the wrong way in front of all these things, but also doesn't want to say the Samaritan was the neighbor, he has to give the right answer. And so he says, he doesn't say the Samaritan, he says the one who stopped and rendered aid. And Jesus said, you go and do likewise, right? So Jesus, I love to point that out because he is like getting into the nitty gritty of what is the context and the culture of the day. And he's nailing it with this story. And these people right around there are lit up, no doubt, okay? But that's his answer. Love God, love people, love your neighbor. So who is my neighbor then? Well, what can we gather from this? And the answer to that is anyone who's on your path. Doesn't matter their background, their circumstance, their situation. You know, we would say anyone. Now, the problem with everyone being my neighbor, which is true, is that everyone or anyone doesn't have a face. You see, I can say theologically everyone in my path is my neighbor, but that doesn't make a specific person my neighbor, right? It doesn't put a face on it and give me something intentionally to lean into. And one of the things that this book pulls out by Jay Pathing and Dave Runyon, a quote here that I think is so important for us to hear is, the problem is, however, that when we aim for everything, we hit nothing. When we insist we're neighbors with everybody, often we end up being neighbors with nobody. And really, that's what's going on in our neighborhoods today. If you're really to listen to people, what you hear is isolation. I don't really know my neighbors. Misunderstanding, like they assume some things about their neighbors. I have a neighbor, in fact, who's always telling me what's going on all around there. It's like, Pastor Brian, did you see Pastor Brian? Like, can I just be Brian in the neighborhood? Do I have to be Pastor Brian? But okay. And then once I asked, have you ever talked to them about that? No. It's a misunderstanding. I know because I have talked to them about that. So, but we have like real misunderstandings, and we have fear that come out of those misunderstandings, right? That we just don't understand people. So we assume things, we fill in the blanks for ourselves, and then we have this fear, which leads to more isolation, all that. But Jesus teaches us to do something completely different in this parable. And I think for us, we need to understand, yes, everyone is our neighbor. But the people that live right around me are specifically my neighbor. They're my mission field. They're my closest circle of influence. They're my responsibility from a kingdom perspective. Right? So I want you to think about them in light of what I'm getting ready to say to you. There are about 3 things that we need to do to begin to love the people next door. Okay? Besides just saying we love our neighbor because we're Jesus people. The first one is this, is that we need to develop compassion. Develop compassion. So Luke 10:33 says specifically about the Samaritan that as he journeyed, he came where the person was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. Compassion. So compassion, let me just define that for you if you're thinking like that's a nebulous concept, like am I just feeling it for someone on the inside of my home? Oh, I feel so sorry for them. Or am I actually doing something about it? Compassion is awareness of and willingness to help someone in need. Compassion goes beyond niceties. It's more than waving on your way to work. Compassion knows a person's name. Compassion knows a person's phone number, that they could actually text this person or call this person if they needed to. And compassion knows a person's need beyond just their face. You know, everybody's putting on a happy face these days. Compassion knows what's beyond what was presented in a, how you doing? I'm fine, great, good to see you later. Right? We need to develop compassion. Angela made me well aware of, Angela, I don't know if you know her, my wife. She is one of the most compassionate people on the planet. In fact, I think it's a gift that God has given her, but she's always helping me because I am not actually one of the most compassionate people on the planet, especially about a few things. And one of those is cats. So I realized people feel different ways about cats, right? Half the room is like, I love cats. I have 16 cats. And would you raise your hand if you just love cats? Come on, bless God. Don't invite me to your house. I will sneeze. I will have to have an inhaler. I mean, it's cats and me, not so much. But then there's the rest of the room, like me, that like don't really love cats. How many of you don't really love cats, right? See, it's a little less than 1 to 2. I mean, it's like 1/3 of the room is willing to admit they don't really love cats. Who would drive over a cat if you had the chance? I knew it. I knew it. Okay, put your hands down. They were happy to raise their hands. That's sick, people. You be at prayer at the end. You come forward. I'll see you right here. But that's the thing is I have a low compassion quotient for a cat, and one of our neighbors, they lost their cat. It died after like 12 years, and Angela told me the story in my living room, and how she was like so compassionate, and I was like, good, that cat is always coming and like making our dog bark and all this. And anyway, so she goes, if you see her, you need to not be that way. And I'm like, okay, understand. So a couple mornings ago, I take my dog out. It's like 6 a.m. I have a lot to do. I'm trying to get him to hurry. Like, come on, man, go, go, go. And and then the lady comes, and she's been out for an early morning walk, and she's hey, and I'm like, hey, I love them, by the way. We're good neighbors. We are, they to us and us to them. And she told me she lost her cat. And I was like, this is the test, because I'm not a morning person either. And so it's 6 a.m. I'm supposed to have compassion. Okay? And I said, I'm sorry. And then she began to tell me like what this cat meant to her. And all of a sudden, I had this weird feeling in my heart, like, oh man, you're like experiencing loss. Like, this is grief to you. And I was like, what is this compassion thing for a cat situation, By the time she was done, like, I just wanted to pray with her. And I asked her, because they're older, I asked her, are you going to get another cat? She said, no, we're 83 and I think we would die before the cats. And I'm like, oh, this is getting awful. Like, we'll take your cat. That's where I'm at that point. That happens. And, but she needed compassion, right? Over something that I wasn't compassionate about at all. And it's a silly, funny story, but it actually is true. And I had to learn in that situation, like, okay, she needs compassion. This is my neighbor. If I'm going to love her, I'm going to have to love her in the sense that she's lost this cat in her life that's really grieving her. So we need to develop compassion. Second thing we need to do is develop flexibility. Luke 10:31-33, it tells us what the Samaritan, what the priest and the Levite didn't do. They didn't have any flexibility in their schedule, apparently. And so it tells us that the priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. We give it to the priest and to the Levite that they had somewhere to get. Or maybe they didn't want to be unclean. So they weren't flexible. We don't ever ask the question, like, where was the Samaritan going? I mean, he's on a road too. He's going somewhere in this story. I don't know if he was, what he had or what was going on. But the point is, he stopped. He stopped and he rendered first aid. And it probably changed his day. He had to find an inn. So he either had to go back to Jerusalem. What if he's halfway? Like, do I go to Jericho? Do I go to Jerusalem? I'm going to Jericho. The prices are cheaper. It's downhill. That's where I'm going, Or do I go back up to Jerusalem where, everything is more expensive and it's uphill? I don't know what's going through his head. But he had to stop. He rendered aid, and then he took him to an inn. And open tab. I mean, Jesus puts an open tab in this story. If I take Larry and Kay here and I say, I'm going to put you in this inn because your house flooded. I'm going to pay for that. I'm probably not going to leave an open tab in my flesh. I'm not going to say, I'll be back in 3 weeks, whatever you want, go wherever you want to go, do whatever you want to do. To the innkeeper, take care of them, whatever they need, and whatever the bill is, when I get back, I'll pay it, right? I'm probably going to be thinking, like, I got a car that needs to go in the shop, I got to pay, it's time to pay tuition, college tuition. And I'm going to probably give Larry like a $15 Starbucks card. Say, dude, this will get you at least 1.5 cups of coffee, in the flesh. But not that Jesus leaves an open tab there where it's like, you know what, it's costing this guy not only time, but money. And that's interesting to me because Jesus is saying you're going to have to, if you're going to be love people like you need to be loved. You're going to have time for them, and you're going to have financial resource, whatever you have, whatever it is, you're going to have to be willing to use it for them, right? Now that's tough, but that's what he's calling for. That's what he's asking us to do, and so we have to develop flexibility both financially and in our schedules in order to love people the way they need to be loved. Here's the third thing. We need to develop intentionality. Intentionality. That means that we have to do this on purpose. We're not just like waiting for this random opportunity, but we have to identify who our neighbors are, understand their needs, and then show compassion on purpose. And that's exactly what we see here in verse 34 and 35. He had a plan. First aid, get him to an inn, pay the bill, leave an open tab, I'll come back and get him. So he's not only giving him that day, he's giving him another day. And so we have to be intentional. We have to be purposeful. We used to live, not far from here, when I was in my 20s. I was a youth pastor, and we had the girl that's in college was about 4 at this time. And I had 1, 2, and Eden, the youngest one, wasn't around yet. And we had a neighbor at that time of our life. His name was George. He was an interesting, and let me just say, persnickety old man. I was 26, he was 80, right? So here's our approach to each other. His approach to me is, you, son, are wet behind the ears. You don't know what you're talking about. But I'm going to come out here on the driveway every night when you get home, and I'm going to tell you, you don't know what you're talking about. And also, I know that you're a pastor, and that makes you doubly idiotic. And so I'm going to tell you all about that, too. And I'm going to ask you a lot of questions that you don't have the answer for. But you're in seminary, and you think you should know, so you're going to tell me a lot of big words, and I'm going to tell you it's bunk. Okay? My approach to him, you're an old man. You don't know what you're talking about. All you can see is through one lens. I don't even know what you're talking about, World War II. What is that? I wasn't around. Bomber pilot? What, are you kidding me? Let me just tell you about the hermeneutics behind the theology of salvation and the book of Romans. How about that? You know, it was that, right? It's 26 and in seminary and it's dumb. And so, but there was part of us as men that liked that about each other, which was weird. Like, oh, good, I'm looking for a fight today. I had a bad day. There's George, vice versa. And so that's how we kind of did things for a while, but we enjoyed it about each other, and we never got mad at each other. I mean, it was always just like, that was fun. And that was just a personality in my personality, I suppose. And so, but one day, he was pristine about his yard. And I was mowing my yard, and I noticed 1 week, it's getting a little scraggly. That's odd for George. Week 2, I'm mowing my yard. It's worse. So I went inside to Angela because Angela had this sweet relationship with him. He loved Angela. He would bring her popsicles, candy, flowers, and I'm like, I'm a terrible husband compared to George, next door. And so she had a great relationship with him and a lot of compassion for him. And so she reminded me that he was feeling sick a little earlier, and it turned out he had cancer, but we didn't know it yet. And so I'm mowing the yard, and literally one day the Lord just said, just keep going across your driveway, just mow his yard. I'm like, Lord, I have to be at a committee meeting tonight at the church. We're going to talk about crazy things like pressure washing the brick molding facade for $153. We're all going to vote on it, Lord. No, just mow his yard. So we did. So I just kept mowing his yard. And I didn't know if he was home, if he wasn't home, all that. I tried to take special care because I knew that he was very, very pristine about how he did things. So I raised, the mower a little bit because it was long, and I didn't want it to look, all that scabbed, and some left because the blade couldn't cut it. It was all that, and then I edged it with my weed eater. I'm pretty good at that. Don't tell anybody. I like to do that. And when I got done, I was just cleaning up, and he came out, and he had tears in his eyes, and he just said, "Thanks for mowing my yard." And I was like, that's the first positive thing you've ever said to me. Well, a little more time goes by, and Angela tells me, because she pays attention, Angela tells me that George is in the hospital down at St. John's over there. It was St. John's at the time. It's a Methodist now, but so she said, you need to go over there. I'm like, why? So he can yell at me about how I'm wrong? She goes, go over there. Okay, so I go over there, and he is so happy to see me. And to him, I'm not Pastor Brian at all. I'm Brian. We have this relationship, all that. And I go in there, and he goes, I'm so happy to see you. I had a dream last night with you in it. And I was like, oh no, what did I do in your dream? And he said, I dreamed I died. And there was this light. There's always a light when people dream they die. But there's this light. I walked through the light, and there was this big table. And this man, I'm going to cry for service number 2. This man sitting behind the table, and on the table was a big book, and this man was dressed in light. That's how he said it. Dressed in light. And the man said to me, George, your name is not in this book. But you need to go ask Brian why your name isn't in the book. This is a hospital room, right? And I'm thinking, first, that's really weird. I've never seen God do anything like that. And then second, like, this is God, like, trying to get my attention. Like, tell this man how his name could be written in the Lamb's book of life. Besides we've had all the apologetic conversations. We've had all the, if God is so good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? All those conversations. We've had all those in the driveway, eating popsicles. And in that moment, he was open to the gospel. He's an old man, 80-something. Lived hard. So I told him what those scriptures you read earlier, I told him those scriptures. And I said, man, you got the biggest gift of anybody I've ever heard of. I mean, Jesus literally told you, I want you to hear. He chose you. So I just told you, you just need to pray. Confess your sin to God. Ask him to write your name in that Lamb's book of life. Tell him you believe in Jesus, the Son of the Most High God, that he was raised again. He prayed. He received Christ that day. He died 3-4 months later or something. You know what I think it started with? 2 things. One was Angela's constant compassion for this man. And I think he looked at an act of kindness and it changed his heart. Thanks for mowing my yard. And the Lord certainly used that in his mind. However dreams work and all that stuff, I don't know. But the Lord certainly used that. And he thought to himself, if I'm going to ask anybody that question, it should be Brian. Right? I was just being a neighbor, not a pastor. So we have to be intentional, purposeful. Now, when you think about your neighborhood, the people around you, today when you came in, you got a worship guide that looked like this. If you didn't get it, don't panic, because you can get it on the way out the door, but you need to grab it today when you go out the door. It's white and it's on the stands by the door, but inside of it, there is a card that I'm going to call a neighborhood map. Now, I'm going to show you a picture of it on the screen for those of you that don't have it. So what this intends to do is help you identify the people who live around you, all right? So you'll see on the card, the middle house is yours. I realize not everybody lives in a square, okay? But you do have 8 homes in some proximity around you. So what if, in the goodwill that everyone is our neighbor, what if we just took it seriously, the Great Commandment seriously, with the 8 homes closest to us as our neighbors? And here's what I'd like you to do. I got 3 things. 1, I'd like you to write their name and the proper proximity to your house on this card. First and last. Now, in this book that I've been reading called The Art of Neighboring, they did some research and they found most of us only about 10% of us can name first and last names of the 8 neighbors living around us. Okay? So if you can do that today, you're in the top 10%. You're going to Harvard in the neighboring category, okay? Many people can't do that. That's the first thing I'd like you to do. Second thing, if after you get that part, I'd like for you to write some basic info about that person. Where they grow up, who are their kids, what's their season of life, what football team do they root for? Just basic information, something that you can know about them that's more personal than just a wave with no name. And then the third thing, I'd like you to write down some in-depth information that you would know after connecting with them. And that would be things like, what are their needs? What are their real needs? What are they going through? Right? And that will give you an understanding for how to pray, how to help. So you've got this in your worship guide today, and I've given you in the faith talk, which is meant for you and for your families, your life groups, whatever. And in the faith talk and the worship guide, it's going to guide you through this. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do in the next week, because we're going to spend 3 weeks on this. And we're going to give you this card every week for 3 weeks, because I think this is so important. I want you to find out this week all of their names. If you're like me, you've got to go to 2 houses and figure out, like, who is that? Okay? So here's my plan. Ready? They open the door. Oh, yeah, I've seen you around the neighborhood. Yeah, I live right there, 1410. I've lived here 7.5 years. How long have you lived here? 20? Hey, what's your name? Roy, if that's his name. Hey, Roy, I'm Brian. I'm your neighbor. If you need anything, let me know, man. See ya. I'm not selling anything, I promise. See ya. They're going to laugh, but I'm going to know his name. I'm going to start praying for him. Okay? And if you got to do that with eight people around you, do it with 8 people around you. If you already know them, bless God and go to part B. You know, what are some basic things that I can know about these persons? You're going to start praying for them in their home, but then you're going to begin looking at them with open eyes for, like, how can I offer them compassion? Because I guarantee you the world does not offer them that. Jesus knew that the world was a hard place, and that neighbors that are believers need to love their neighbors. And the open door is compassion.